Welcome to another episode of our video series of the critique of modern systems. I hope you're doing well today. I am feeling pretty energized even after spending the morning with some really dense, fascinating material. How are you holding up?
I'm excellent, thank you. And yes, dense is the right word, but in the best way. This is the kind of material that, it really forces you to step back and ask some fundamental questions.
I couldn't agree more. So today, we're going to be exploring neurodiversity, specifically autistic spectrum conditions. But we're approaching this from a pretty different angle.
That's right. Our goal here for you is to unpack this idea that we shouldn't be looking at this as a deficiency at all. The real mission is to understand why this kind of difference is not just an inconvenience.
The necessity.
A biological necessity. It's about resilience for our entire species. The sources we're looking at make a powerful case that the problem isn't the individual, but the rigid, fast-paced world we've built.
Let's start there then, with that immediate reality for families. If you're raising a neurodiverse person, the sources describe life as this constant management of, uncertainty.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like?
It's exhausting. I mean, you have the day-to-day unpredictability, of course, sensory triggers, communication hurdles, but then there's the financial burden, which is just immense.
We're talking about specialized education, therapies.
Exactly, or even just finding a doctor who gets it. So many families feel like they're totally dependent on these, these very fragile outside resources. A temporary tutor, a funding stream that could just disappear next year. It creates this underlying current of panic, of helplessness.
That feeling of being a sacrificial lamb you mentioned, just constantly battling a system for basic support.
Yes, and that's what these groups are trying to flip on its head. The whole paradigm is shifting from dependency to empowerment.
So not just short-term fixes for the child.
No, not at all. It's about building resilience in the whole ecosystem, equipping the caregivers, the parents, the family with real tools for lifelong management, and crucially, strengthening those adjacent fields. Teachers, doctors, health workers.
So everyone in the chain is on the same page.
Right. If everyone can communicate and manage the reality of it, that feeling of helplessness, it starts to fade. You go from being a victim of the system to an active manager of your situation.
That makes it so much more tangible. I'm thinking of those simulations the sources mentioned, like using a VR headset to try and mimic the sensory experience.
That's so important.
The exaggerated sounds, the tunnel vision, the heart rate. Because talking about sensory overload is one thing, but to feel a flicker of it.
It's a total game changer. It is.
Right.
Because a theoretical understanding that, say, the metro is loud is useless. It means nothing. But to experience a sound that is physically painful or to be unable to filter out a background hum, that changes everything.
It's like that anecdote about the parent on the train.
Exactly. They were trying to read a book and the noise was just so overwhelming they couldn't focus and it was almost physically oppressive. And in that moment, they finally understood their child's sensitivity. That little flicker of shared experience broke through a wall.
It just shows the massive gap between knowing the name for something and actually understanding the reality of it.
It does. And speaking of that gap, one of the most startling things in the materials was that feedback from people working in the field. Some of them scored the actual level of awareness, of true understanding, at a 0 out of 10.
A 0. That's almost impossible to believe.
It's shocking, but I think it speaks to how superficial our understanding is. We are great at putting things in boxes, We can name Asperger's, we can name ADHD, but we fail to grasp the daily individual implications. We've got the classification down, but not the comprehension.
Which brings us to really the central evolutionary question here. If natural selection is supposed to, eliminate the unfit, then why does autism still exist? And why do the rates seem to be going up?
Right. If it's so challenging in our current society, why wasn't it selected out thousands of years ago?
Exactly.
And its persistence, across every culture, every generation, it strongly suggests that it serves some kind of critical adaptive function for the species as a whole. It might be a challenge for the individual in this specific modern context.
But it's providing value to the group.
Immense value. And this leads right into this idea of the tyranny of the normal.
Tell us about that. How does this concept of a norm create so much anxiety?
Well, this obsession with a template, a single norm, it's pretty recent, historically speaking. It's rooted in 19th and 20th century ideas of the nation state. You needed uniformity for factories, for armies, for administration. Difference was messy.
Inconvenient.
Very inconvenient, and that expectation for sameness is still baked into all our systems. Schools, workplaces, insurance models. So when a child comes along who doesn't fit that neat statistical average, it triggers panic. Other parents worry, what about my child? This will disrupt the curriculum, the norm.
So the fear isn't the child, it's the disruption of the order.
It's the breakdown of an easy-to-manage, predictable system.
Exactly.
And that desire for a stable, predictable system is just completely at odds with the world we've actually created. You make this critical point about the two different speeds of change.
This is the absolute core of the issue, and most people just miss it.
Yeah.
You have biological evolution, which is, it's glacially slow. It needs millions of years. It needs consistent environmental pressure for maybe 500,000 years to hard code a significant adaptation.
But our environment changes, what, every 6 months now?
Right, that's the other speed, cultural and technological evolution. It operates at light speed. Think about it. 10 years ago, the idea of sharing your location 24/7 was bizarre. Now you can't even meet a friend for coffee without it.
So our technology is moving so fast.
So fast that it actually prevents biological adaptation. We can't keep up. We've effectively outrun our own DNA.
And we call this the technology trap. We were all promised that computers would save us time, make life simpler.
And is anyone less busy? Everyone is more stressed, more overcommitted than ever before. The time we save is instantly filled with new demands from the tech itself.
It's a stark irony, isn't it? Technology solves one tedious task, and instead of taking a breath, we fill that space with 6 new, often pointless tasks. We read the same news headline on 5 different apps. We're just running faster and faster on a treadmill of our own making.
Which leads to this constant low-grade anxiety.
Because our biology is screaming threat. The environment is changing too quickly for our systems to process as safe or stable.
Okay, so if we can't adapt biologically, the sources suggest we're at a major pivot point, that we're starting to bypass evolution. This is where that idea of a post-human period comes in.
Yes, and this is probably one of the most profound ideas they explored. The hypothesis is that since our biology is now fundamentally mismatched with the world we've created, we're going to start merging with our technology to compensate.
You mean bionics, digital implants?
It could be. Or just an increasing reliance on external tech for things like memory, perception, function. The moment we start substantially augmenting ourselves with technology to overcome the biological limits that our own culture has imposed, well, at that point, we're not really Homo sapiens in the traditional, naturally selected sense anymore. We're becoming something designed.
That is a staggering thought. Let's bring this back to the here and now. The value of neurodiversity today in this broken system. What is the unique strength that a divergent brain offers?
Oh, an immense strength. You could argue that high-functioning autistic individuals, the people we used to label with Asperger's, are the backbone of modern science and tech. Quantum physics, complex engineering, data analysis.
Why those fields in particular?
It's the capacity for intense, sustained focus, a dedication to routine and concentration that many neurotypical brains just can't maintain. They can engage with these incredibly abstract, complex problems for hours, days, years, in a way that others find tedious.
So we need both.
We absolutely need both. We need the broad, flexible thinking of neurotypical brains for general survival, but we desperately need the specialized, deep-dive thinking of divergent brains to push knowledge forward.
Which really means we need to completely re-examine what we call a disability.
We have to. The true disability in a classroom or an office is often not being neurodiverse. It's the inability of the system around that person to adapt to difference. The real limitation is our collective failure to communicate with someone who doesn't fit a prepackaged mold.
So what you're saying is the non-normal child in a classroom is actually a gift to the other students.
It's an unparalleled gift. It's an opportunity for social growth. If you don't learn how to be patient, how to understand someone who experiences the world differently, then you are the one who is socially handicapped. It teaches empathy, flexibility, skills far more valuable than anything in a textbook.
Which sort of torpedoes our old ways of measuring intelligence, doesn't it? Like IQ tests.
They're becoming more and more obsolete. An IQ test was designed to see if you could remember things, which was a great skill in, the 1970s when you had to go to a library. Now your phone remembers everything for you.
So high IQ can almost be a curse now.
It can be. The sources suggest it often leads to a lot of unhappiness because you see how illogical the world is, how inefficiently other people act, and it's incredibly frustrating. The skill of rote memory it's been outsourced.
So the final push then is for real, actionable acceptance, not just passive tolerance.
Exactly. Focus on the strengths, the potential. And the market is already doing this, by the way. High-functioning individuals are being actively recruited in cybersecurity, in software development, in defense.
Because their focus is a competitive advantage.
A clear advantage. Meticulous work, lower error rates. The economic reality is finally catching up with the biological necessity.
So, to pull this all together, the core message seems to be, we have to stop seeing this as a defect. We need to see it as a necessary variation for human resilience. The problem isn't the person, it's the rigid society that can't keep up.
And that means we have to be proactive. If the detection rates are, 1 in 44 children and maybe still rising, we have to act now. I love the motto they developed. We must be kind to the coming generations, polish the coming generations.
Prepare the systems for the future. Don't force the future into our outdated systems.
That's it in a nutshell.
So we're left with a final, pretty provocative thought. If these trends continue, if detection rates keep climbing, what happens if, say, 50% of the population is eventually identified as autistic? Who's the minority then? Who's abnormal?
And that, right there, that question, reveals the real problem, the concept of normal itself. It's an arbitrary line in the sand, a self-imposed prison. If we keep clinging to uniformity, we will fail to adapt to the world we ourselves are creating. We have to abolish that rigid definition if we're going to survive our own acceleration.